This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State law professor Roger McEowen and K-State Extension Assistant Rich Llewelyn start today's show by discussing the 75th Annual Kansas Tax Institute sessions that start in November. Continuing the show is K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner. As harvest is taking place, cattle producers might be thinking about having their cattle graze the crop residue. Jason brings up a few key considerations for people before starting. K-State Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts round out today's show. This week, Brad White, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster have a conversation about if cattle body condition scores should be recorded when preg checking. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with some information from K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen and K-State Extension Assistant Rich Llewelyn. Roger, Rich, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, good to be here, Shelby.
Roger, Rich, both wanting today to talk about the Kansas Tax Institute, which is something K-State Research and Extension puts on in K-State Agricultural Economics Department. And Roger, first talking about some of the presenters and topics that will be covered on this day.
Well, the topics at each location and for both of the online schools are fairly constant from day one to day two. And just as an example, we're going to start out on day one with new developments in the law. What has happened in tax law? What's happened with the IRS over the past year since we last had the tax schools last fall? And of course, one of those big ones is the employee retention credit, which is right now paused because of all of the fraud that's associated with the program. IRS has decided not to process any more ERC claims until we get to January, which is causing other problems. So we're going to go through that and various types of things that came out of legislation last year involving energy credits and corporate taxes and health care and payroll tax provisions, and then Form 1099-K issues. And then another big aspect of day one at the schools, that we do have a discrepancy here. Day one for the online schools, which the first one is online and the last one is online exclusively. And then day two at the other events will be ag issues. And that is a major feature of the tax schools. In fact, for many years, the tax schools were known as the farm tax institutes. But agriculture, obviously, is number one industry in the state. And at some point in time, I think the last survey that I remember seeing, Rich, it's been some time, that just about 90% of all farm returns in Kansas were prepared by people that went through the Kansas Tax Institutes. Now, I don't know if that survey information has been updated, but this has been a major feature of the tax schools for many, many times. And we're going to talk about such things as deducting residual soil fertility and charitable remainder trust and tax issues with easement payments, and get into death of a farmer, what happens when a farmer dies, and the associated 1041 for the trust or the estate, and unique issues such as a growing crop in a field or livestock or crops that have been contracted at the time of death but won't be delivered until after death. And what do you do with tax attributes and basis issues with property in a decedent's estate? And so that's the ag discussion. And then at day one of all of the schools, we're going to get into small business issues. And one of the aspects on that the Kansas Department of Revenue will talk about on day one at each location in the online schools will be the pass-through entity tax in Kansas. This is as a result of Congress severely limiting the deduction for state and local taxes under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so states have come up with their own workaround on that. And Kansas has their own pass-through entity tax. And so that's going to be a major part of day one, plus issues with the Corporate Transparency Act, the Form 7203, we'll get into that, and other things such as capitalization and repair. We'll review those rules. We'll have an in-depth session on partnership taxation, and then kind of a review of various depreciation topics and get into some retirement plan issues. That's all on day one of the schools.
Then, Roger, what's going to be taking place on day two?
On day two, we'll continue the discussion with respect to new developments that weren't concluded on day one, and at the online schools and out west for Hayes and Garden City, we're going to break up ag issues on day one and day two. And so on day two, we'll have the second part of ag issues, and we'll get into buy-sell agreements and, as I said, 1041s for farm estates and trusts, and how you handle research and experimental as well as developmental expenses on the return. And then we'll get an update of some recent ag rulings and cases. Then some individual taxpayer issues such as estimated tax payments and how you plan for college costs from a tax standpoint, and settling a taxpayer's estate, a non-farm estate, for example. One of the things on day 2 that's important to tax practitioners is that they have to have information security plans in place to protect client data. And we're going to go through that on day 2 and what is all involved with a written information security plan. And then there'll be an IRS update on day 2, and what are the new forms and instructions, the 1099 filing procedures, correspondence audits, timely mailed and received dates and statute limitations, and a little bit of discussion on OICs, or offers to compromise. There'll also be a session on independent contractors, which has become really big, particularly the last 5 or 6 years. And we'll go through the worker classification rules and the tax home issues, how you treat travel expenses and meal and entertainment expenses. And then we'll wrap up day 2 at each location with rulings and cases. It's kind of a quick-paced, fun session of what's happened in the courts, non-ag specific, that bear on tax clients. And so we'll go through rulings and cases to end each location.
And Roger, you are one of the presenters at this institute. However, you have some other experts joining you.
I do. This is my 31st year of doing this, and joining me on day 1 out west in Garden City and Hayes, as well as in the online schools, is Paul Meefer, who is formerly with Clifton Larson Allen. He's now retired from that, but he and I do a lot of seminars throughout the year together. And also the Department of Revenue. Carl York and Roger Basinger will be presenting on day 1 at each location, as well as both online schools. Day 2, I'll be at every location on day 2, as well as Kathy Murphy. Kathy Murphy is retired IRS, and she has her own tax practice in the St. Louis area now. And so we're at every location on day 2, and Paul will be with me on the online school to begin this tax schools and the online one to finish the tax schools on day 1, plus the locations in person at Garden City and Hayes on day 1. At the other schools, in person, not online, but in person at Wichita, Salina, Lawrence, and Pittsburgh, day 1 will be Ed Morse, who is a professor of taxation at Creighton Law School, as well as the Department of Revenue.
And Rich, this Kansas Tax Institute is taking place at many different locations.
We have 6 in-person locations as well as 2 online meetings. The whole series begins November 2nd with the first online meeting, and then the following week we're in Garden City and Hayes, and then we have Lawrence, Salina, Wichita, and also Pittsburgh in person, and then we end up right before Christmas with the second online session.
So a lot of different places for people to hopefully have the opportunity to attend from across the state.
Right. We try to get throughout the state so folks can attend in person if they want to, and if they're unable to do that, we do have the 2 in-person meetings or online meetings.
And this is a 2-day event for people. However, it could just be 1.
Yes, they can attend one day if they want. We offer continuing education credits, and so 8 hours of credit for each day. So for both days, it's 16 hours for accountants and tax attorneys. 15 hours of credit is available for IRS practitioners as well as certified financial planners.
And is it okay for people to make their 1-day attendance the second day of the
Yes, either day would be fine depending on which topics they'd prefer to hear.
And so for people who are interested in this, how do they go about registering for it?
We have on our website, agmanager.info. The Kansas Income Tax Institutes can be found on the first page. They can click there, and there's links for registration, also more information, as well as the brochures available there.
And what is the cost and deadline for registration?
The deadline is 2 weeks ahead of each meeting, so it's kind of a rolling deadline. And so the first one coming up will be next week on October 20th will be the deadline for the online meeting, November 2nd and 3rd. And then that's a rolling deadline. The cost for both days in person is $375, which includes meals both days, as well as materials in the continuing ed. We don't have the meals for the online meetings, so those are a little cheaper. It's $315 for 2 days of online meetings.
For people who are thinking about attending, should they have a little bit of knowledge about this before coming?
That is preferable because we do get pretty deep on some of the subject matter, obviously, and tax prep has become more complex as the years go by. And so the discussion gets pretty complex. You don't want to walk into this cold, although we do have some that aren't professional tax preparers that attend. And I think they find it helpful also, at least the feedback is to me that they find it helpful. But I wouldn't turn anybody away that's interested in it. But these are professional meetings for those that are preparing returns. And so you probably would feel lost if you showed up and you just thought you were going to have a fun day doing this and didn't really have an interest in preparing returns.
Who would you encourage to attend the 75th Annual Kansas Income Tax Institute?
CPAs, tax professionals, enrolled agents and tax preparers of all stripes. That includes attorneys, too, that do returns as part of their practice. So those would be the primary audience. We do have a handful of farmers that do attend, and we have some that work for firms that keep books for the firm. So accountants in general. Whether you're a CPA or not really doesn't matter. But if you're working with returns or you're in an office that prepares returns, you're an office assistant, you're going to find these schools pretty helpful.
Roger, Rich, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen, and he was joined by K-State Extension Assistant Rich Llewelyn, and they were discussing the upcoming 75th Annual Kansas Income Tax Institute. You can find out more information about this event by going to agmanager.info, and I will link it on agtoday.net in today's show notes. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Wednesday show with some considerations producers might want to keep in mind when they think about grazing their cattle on crop residues. And to discuss this topic, we're joined by cow-calf extension specialist at K-State, Jason Warner. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. Thanks for having me on, as always.
So for producers who are thinking about incorporating grazing crop residues into their winter feeding program, what are a few things they need to keep in mind?
You know, I think crop residues are a really valuable resource for our beef cattle producers from the standpoint of being able to provide a low-cost forage resource now as we go into the fall and in through the winter months. That really can help extend the grazing season and reduce our feed costs. And so now as folks are getting into the full swing of harvest around the state, I know there's always questions and considerations with grazing crop residues, both corn and grain sorghum and soybean residues as well. And so several things that folks want to be able to, or we encourage folks to be keeping in mind there with that. But one of the things that I think is a key important consideration that we always have to keep in mind, regardless if it's corn or grain sorghum or soybean residue, is that, you know, after harvest, the amount of forage biomass that we have out there on that field, that's what we've got to start with, and that's all that we're going to have. Unlike a typical growing season with pastures where we've got regrowth, the amount of biomass and available plant material that we have out there for those cattle to consume, that's what we have, and it's going to decrease in both quality and quantity as the season advances, as we leave those cattle out there longer. So that has implications from a feeding and a supplementation standpoint, but it's just always important to recognize that quality and quantity both decrease over time as the grazing season advances. But it's one of those things where one thing that we want to keep in mind is that cattle are selective in terms of their grazing habits. They're very selective as far as how they graze, and they're always going to consume or go after the most palatable crop components or components of that residue first. And so they're always going to consume the grain first. Whatever grain is available out there, they're going to go after that, especially if they're experienced and they've grazed crop residue fields before. They're going to go after that first, followed by husk and leaf material, and then finally the stalk or the stem of the plant. They'll consume that last if they're in a situation where they need to do so.
For the cattle grazing, there are a few health concerns that producers should keep in mind.
So one thing that we always receive a lot of questions about and is always certainly an issue that we want for folks to be keeping in mind is if we're in a situation, if we've got a lot of down grain on the field, on the surface of the field, regardless of whether that's corn or grain sorghum, due to wind loss or if we have bad lodging or whatever reason. In some situations, maybe if there's a hail event prior to when those crops are harvested and we have a lot of grain down on the surface, that certainly can create some risk because, as I mentioned, those cattle are selective in terms of how they graze. They're going to go after and find that grain content first. And so when cattle rapidly consume a high level of grain and starch in their diet, that puts us at a greater risk for acidosis or founder. And we know that we can run into a number of different health challenges and potential losses with cattle, of course, when we're in that type of a situation. And so we always want to be thinking about that. And certainly if we're in a situation, if we've got more than 20 bushels of grain per acre down, then that's a situation where we need to start using some different management approaches and rethinking some things that we might do there from a management standpoint to offset or mitigate that risk. And so some things that we would want to keep in mind there that can potentially be beneficial would be providing some other supplemental hay or some feed to help decrease the amount of grain that those cattle are going to consume. One thing that might be beneficial is maybe doing strip grazing or decreasing the amount of area availability that those cattle have to be able to graze, not letting them have access to the entire field, but only allowing them to have access to a part of it to increase your stocking density over that part of the field and decrease the amount of grain that's available per animal. And so that's a strategy that can certainly work well if you've got really high levels of grain down on the field. But then, of course, you have to be able to move the fence and allow those cattle to have access to the rest of the field as you go throughout the season. But you got to be able to manage that. But that's certainly one thing that can work. If there's a lot of grain or a lot of corn or milo down, another approach can be just simply supplementing grain or milo to those cattle prior to turning them out for a period of time, 1 to maybe 2 weeks, increasing that amount slowly over time to maybe up to 0.5 to 0.75% of body weight on a dry matter basis to just increase their ability to be able to utilize that starch in that grain without having any negative associative effects on starch digestion. And so those are some things that we always want folks to keep in mind if they find themselves in that situation and they need to change or rethink their management approach.
And for sorghum, is there a certain thing that producers need to keep in mind with that crop?
One of the biggest things that we run into with grain sorghum is plants that are in that sorghum family, sorghums, sorghum Sudan hybrids, Sudan grasses. They can produce a compound known as prussic acid or hydrocyanic acid. And really our greatest risk with that compound or that toxic compound is right around the time of freezing. So when we get into this time of year when we're really having some cooling, some nighttime temperatures that are getting down close to freezing, but we're not quite freezing yet, and that plant has not received a hard killing frost and that plant is not completely dead. What will happen then is that plant will try to regrowth, and it's the regrowth or the shoots that plant will regenerate, that if they're still green and they're down close to the base of that plant, they're quite palatable to the cattle, and that is where a lot of that prussic acid will accumulate. And so it's during that time of the year, if we're out grazing milo stalks or even a forage sorghum Sudan, forage sorghum hybrid or a sorghum Sudan type of variety, where we've got that regrowth potentially occurring there during that time period when we're getting close to freezing but we're not completely dead. That's where we can potentially run into an issue there. Once that plant is completely dead, we've had a good hard killing frost, that prussic acid will dissipate down over time as the plant cells rupture. And so the risk for running into any potential issues there with cattle is quite low after that time period from a prussic acid standpoint. Now, nitrates, both grain sorghum and corn can accumulate nitrates certainly, and we know that those accumulate primarily in that bottom 1/3 of the stalk or the stem of the plant. And so the nitrates will potentially be there, and so we want to avoid putting cattle in a situation where they've got to graze the stalk or the stem. We want them to primarily just consume the husk and the leaf material, not graze the stalk or the stem, and that reduces our nitrate risk there.
And Jason, you mentioned fences a little bit ago, and that's one thing producers might need to really keep in mind, as well as water.
Water and fence is really our greatest limiting resource I see when I look around the state on why we don't utilize our crop residue fields for grazing after harvest. And certainly that can be an issue in some areas where we're more limited on being able to provide water and fence for those fields. But that can be fairly easily overcome, and you certainly have to figure that into the cost of grazing those residue fields if you don't have fence around already, and you're going to have to provide water. And certainly if you're going to be renting those fields from a crop producer or you don't own them and you're going to be renting them, you got to make sure that you take into consideration the cost of fencing and water to be able to provide that for those animals. And that's always a key consideration there. And frankly, that's a big reason why a lot of residue fields are not utilized for grazing, because that's certainly a very limiting resource for us.
And for cattle that are grazing crop residues, is there supplementation that is needed?
So that's a really good question, and one of the things that we see there with regards to supplementation, it just depends on the class of cattle and the type of cattle that we're going to have out there grazing. The data would suggest that for mature cows that are in a body condition score 5 or greater at the beginning of the grazing season, for corn residue fields, particularly if we're at a proper stocking rate, the benefit that we'll see there from a supplementation standpoint on protein supplementation is minimal early on in the grazing season. But what we want to keep in mind is that where our forage quality and our quantity decreases over time, the need for supplementation will increase, and particularly in the case of spring calving cows, as they get closer to calving later on, if we're thinking about calving in maybe January or February. Where I think producers have ran into challenges in the past is we've left cattle out on corn stalks too long, and we've taken too much residue off. We've forced those cattle down to graze into the stalk or the stem of the plant, and as a result, our forage quality drops, and we're not able to maintain weight and body condition score on those animals. Thin cows, fall calving cows, replacement heifers, wean calves, animals that we need to add weight and body condition score to. Certainly those animals will need some protein and some energy supplementation, but the data would suggest for mature cows and an acceptable body condition, the need for supplementation early on is pretty minimal, but we want to be thinking about providing that as we get closer to calving.
And Jason, as always, if people would like to find out more information from K-State Beef, where can they do that?
Your local county or district extension office, your area beef specialist, or ksubeef.org.
Jason, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby. Appreciate the opportunity as always.
That was K-State Extension cow-calf specialist Jason Warner. You can find more information from K-State's Beef Extension team by going to ksubeef.org. I will link that in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with the Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts.
Hi, welcome to BCI Ask the Experts. I'm Brad White, joined by two good experts today, Dr. Brian Lubbers.
Good morning, Brad.
Dr. Phillip Lancaster.
Good morning, guys.
Today's listener question is focused on pregnancy test time, and the question is, should I do a body condition score on my cows at pregnancy test? Brian, I'm going to go to you first.
I'll say yes. I think part of the reason is it's such a low input data point, right? If it's at preg check time, the animals are already coming through the chute. It's not a hard skill to kind of learn and develop, and it's simply recording one more number. So I think simply because it doesn't cost you very much to do it, and it's really not about, is it a 4 or is it a 5? Is it a 5 or a 6? You're looking for the extreme edges, right? And so it gives you something to use maybe to manage your cows. If you've got a lot of those extreme ones, you're probably going to have to manage them differently, especially going into the winter. Feed resources are tight. You don't want to be spending money on feed for cows that don't need it, and you certainly want to spend it and target it towards the animals that do. So I think it's a valuable number.
Excellent. Brian starts out with 6 points, and I will define, so body condition scores in cows, beef cows, we often go 1 to 9, 1 being very thin, 9 being very fat. That 5, that is where you're in the middle. The 4 would be a little bit thinner. Philip?
So I think it depends on how you want to use it. So it may be like Brian said, it would be a good number to have to find those thinner cows and know if I'm going to need to give them different nutrition going through the winter and get them back in the body condition score for the next year. But it doesn't necessarily tell me how well they bred up the previous year. So it's not very indicative of where they were at the start of the last breeding season or the previous calving season. So it'd be an indicator of how my breed up was. And I could also look at it from a cow selection standpoint too. And this is a little bit iffy, but if I have a cow that's a little thin at preg check or weaning time, does that mean she was a good milker and so she weaned a big calf? So I'm paying attention to the calf too. But if she's fat at weaning time or preg check time, she's probably not producing as much milk as she really should, and paying attention to her calf. Is her calf smaller than average? And so using that as a cull criteria maybe, or which cows I want to keep heifers out of, could be useful.
So the body condition score gives me some idea, but I have to evaluate it in context. So give me a little bit more of that context, and I'm gonna ask you. I got 5 points, but give me some context for evaluating those. What would be my target body condition score at the time of calving for cows and for heifers? For
cows, 5 to 6, and then for heifers, 6. Probably, we're definitely closer to 6. I wouldn't necessarily say 7, but yeah, so about 6. So that would be the target for calving time, because we know they're going to probably lose some body condition between calving and breeding, because that's the peak lactation time. And so then it's hard to keep them in good body condition score during that time. At weaning or preg check at this time of year for a spring calving herd, I probably don't want anybody at a 6, because there probably means that they're not milking the way they should. Again, paying attention to calf weight, weaning weight, and that stuff too. So they should be a little bit thinner if they're putting nutrients into milk like I want them to.
And Brian, you mentioned you may use body score for sorting as you go in. Which cows would you want to sort off? Body score of what number?
Yeah, so it's actually both the extremes on both ends, right? So, and it depends on how many you have and how many pastures you have, what kind of resources you have, right? But if I have really thin cows, I might want to pull them off even if I have the option to put them in a dry lot and feed them a lot heavier. So I usually, like Philip said, kind of 4s, definitely below 4. So 3s and below for sure, maybe 4s. 7 and above, I'm going to manage those differently.
Okay, you guys are knotted up at 8. For the last question, how many pounds does a body score represent? Philip?
80 to 100, depending on cow frame size.
Yeah, I was going to say 75.
Ooh, I was going to say 105. So Philip was closest, so Philip ends up winning. So thanks for joining us. And if you have any questions for us to answer, please send us an email at bci@ksu.edu.
Once again, that was Brad White, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.